In 2008, musician Dave Carroll boarded a flight from Halifax and went through O'Hare and landed in Omaha, Nebraska. But when he picked up his $3,500 Taylor guitar out of the baggage claim, he saw that it was broken. He promptly went to the customer service counter asking what United Airlines could do to remedy the situation, but they blew him off as if they didn't even care. For the next 9 months, Carol was on the phone going through their confusing phone matrix trying to talk to the right person. And after 9 months with no solution given, he decided to publish or to write a song. United Destroys Guitars. And so he published that on YouTube in 2009, early that year. And in the first day, 150,000 people had already viewed that video. By the next day, the director of customer service at United called Carol up to apologize. But then 3 days later, the total view of that one video was 1 million views. Now, at that point, the stock of United Airlines had plummeted 10%. They had lost a total of $180 million. That is over 600,000 times the cost of Carol's Taylor guitar. And yet a week later, United Breaks Guitars became the leading download on most of the downloadable songs you could get online because everybody was raving about this one song. You know, what we see in this short story is that there's a reality, there's a response, and then there's yet another response to that. The reality was, okay, United broke his guitar. They failed to respond, therefore he responded, and then the world responded accordingly. You see, in life, with a reality comes a response. And when we look at the book of Job, we come to a man named Elihu in Job chapter 32. I invite you to turn over there, Job chapter 32. We're not going to read all of Job 32 through 37, but up to this point, we have Job's three friends that have been counseling him, advising him on how he's going to navigate this turmoil, this suffering that he's in. And so when we come to chapter 32, Elihu realizes that his friends have gone nowhere in proving anything to Job. He's obviously the younger of these four friends, and so he decides that he's going to finally speak up and share his mind. And I want to start by reading chapter 32, verse 1 to begin with, and then we'll really camp out later in this dialogue in chapter 36 as we look at really his fourth speech. But let's look and see. Going to remain seated for now because this won't be our main text. I just want you to understand the background leading up to what we're going to look at this morning. So look at what it says in chapter 32, verse 1. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Have we seen that already? Job had an ego. He didn't like people smacking down that ego. And here he is. It's obvious to all he's righteous in his own eyes. So what does Elihu do? Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled because he justified himself rather than God. And against his three friends was his wrath kindled because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, then his wrath was kindled. Now from this point on, we get an idea that Elihu is the youngest. He's trying to refrain himself, but now he's just so angry. He's angry towards Job for justifying himself. He's angry with the three friends for trying to condemn Job. He's had it. He's going to speak his mind. So he extends 4 speeches in the next 5 chapters. Now, I'll be honest, when I read Elihu, I have a hard time tracking him. And if you were to read Elihu, he kind of bounces all over the place. He starts justifying himself in the first speech, saying, hey, I might be younger, but wisdom isn't just limited to those that are old. I have something to say here. And he kind of justifies that initially. And then he stands up for God. He says, hey, God is just. And then he condemns Job in the second speech and says, but Job, you are wrong in trying to justify yourself. And in speech number 3, he again goes back to this idea that God is great, God is just. So he's speaking for God, that's a good thing. But his fourth speech is what I want to focus on this morning. Now, originally, I was going to plan on covering all 5 chapters. But as I got into this, I narrowed it down to 2 truths that I really want to camp out on. And then late last night, like this first truth was just unfolding. And there's so much to this one truth. I'm like, you know what? I got to cut the second truth out. I got to focus on just one truth from Elihu so that we can actually go home, get a break, and come back tonight at 5 o'clock. We don't want to have consecutive church all day. So I decided to cut that. Therefore, guys at the sound booth, you get the morning off. All you can do is listen because I have an outline, but we're not going to follow that outline. I just want to focus on one truth that Elihu relays here. And this is kind of how it works in Elihu's speech. He starts by justifying himself. He kind of chases some rabbits, but finally for the home stretch, speech number 4, he really locks in and says some profound things. And there's really 2 or 3 truths that really stand out. We don't have time for all of those. I want to focus on just one of them this morning, and it's found in chapter 36. Chapter 36. We'll touch on verse 2, but then we'll really get going in verse 7. Now notice how Elihu approaches this differently than any other friend up to this point. Rather than trying to condemn Job, rather than trying to justify himself, rather than trying to lean upon tradition, he speaks for God. Now look at what it says in verse 2. Suffer me a little, and I will show thee what I have yet to speak on God's behalf. Imagine that, speaking for God. No one else has done that up to this point. Nobody's trying to justify God in what he has done or speak of God's great attributes. They're really focusing on, well, justifying why Job might be righteous or why Job might be guilty. And so we come to chapter 36, verse 7. Let's stand out of respect for God. We'll really focus on just about 5 or 6 verses here because I believe this is one of the main truths that even touches on this question, why do the righteous suffer? And this is about as close of an answer as we get to that question in all the book of Job through the words of a younger friend named Elihu. Notice what he says here in verse 7. He, that's God, withdraweth not his eyes from the righteous, but with kings are they on the throne. Yea, he doth establish them forever, and they are exalted. And if they be bound in fetters and be holden in cords of affliction, then he showeth them their work and their transgressions that they have exceeded. Verse 10. He openeth also their ear to discipline and commandeth that they return from iniquity. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasures. But if they obey not, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge. Thank you for staying. You can go and be seated. I want to talk to you this morning about the truth that the trial reveals. We see a truth about God and then a response that is laid out to Job saying, will you respond this way or not respond this way? And maybe directing it to us this morning. There's a reality about God here that once we unfold this, God puts it out to us and says, hey, members, friends, guests of Hillview Baptist Church, which way will you respond to this reality of God? Now, before I get into this reality of God, we sometimes get a mixed up reality of God when we suffer. We're going through a difficult time. We can jump to some false conclusions, such as, God is mad at me. Well, according to the New Testament believers are not under the wrath of God. God is not mad at His own children. Now, that's a totally different story for another day, or a different principle. But that's something that we can jump to the conclusion, God's just mad at me. He has it in for me. And that's a claim that Job has been making. God is my enemy. I'm his target for target practice. That's all that he's doing right now. Could be our perception that, oh, God's not good after all. I don't know if I can trust him. Well, that's not based on truth. That's a false reality of God. It could be even that question saying, is God really doing me right based on how I've tried to live my life? Don't I deserve better than this? But again, we're putting to God what is false, what is not right. Therefore, Elihu states a truth about God to Job that is spot on, that we can see throughout other scriptures. And here's the simple truth. Now, this is where we're going to start. This is what Elihu is basically saying in chapter 36. He makes this statement: God does right to the righteous. Did you get that? God does right to the righteous. Now, that's the only thing that's going to fit with the outline. From here on out, at the meaty table, we'll just leave that up there. The rest is extra, okay? It's bonus material. And so get your pen handy. I'll give you some points here, but it's not going to appear up on the slide behind me. So God does right to the righteous. Now, how does this work? How does God do right to the righteous? Now, Elihu is going to work through this thought, and he makes about 3 or 4 points on how God does right to the righteous. I'm going to be up front with you. You're going to love the first one, okay? I love the first one. I don't like the last 3. And you're not going to like the last 3. So I'm just being up front with you, okay? I'm not going to win friends and gain a lot of influence. I'm not going to get a bigger following. We're not going to get a bigger following with the last 3 points, because God does not necessarily get a bigger following with the final 3 points that we're going to look at to try to explain this principle that God does right to the righteous. Now let's talk about the positive. What do we love about God doing right to the righteous? Look at what it says in verse 7. He would draw not his eyes from the righteous. You know what he's saying, modern terms? God watches over his own. Isn't that a great truth? God watches over his own. And the implication in the latter part of verse 7 is that he promotes the righteous to be kings. He knows how to esteem them. Now, Job wrote this probably close to 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. I mean, we're probably going back to, maybe 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And as we read this, David hadn't come onto the scene yet. Even though in chronology of our Bible, we would think that Job comes after the life of David, David hadn't come yet. But he was actually describing David's life at this point, because David, a shepherd boy, just faithfully watching the sheep, was a righteous man in God's eyes. And God took him from watching the sheep, and Samuel almost looked over him, but finally realized he's God's anointed him in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And God promotes him to being king over Israel. That's a great example of what he's talking about. God was watching over the righteous shepherd boy David and promoted him to be king. Have you seen that in your life? God takes those that are doing right, and whatever goes around comes around in a good way. God takes record of a person's track record, their life, what they're doing, how they're conducting themselves, and over time sees fit to reward them for those efforts, for that benevolence, for that kindness, that graciousness. And we see that here in verse 7. He would draw not his eyes from the righteous, but with kings, they are on the throne. Hey, I'm looking over the righteous, I see them, and I'm going to make sure that they can stand before kings. It reminds me of Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29. Seest thou a man who is diligent in his ways? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men or common men. I think of 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12. This is Peter almost giving a rendition of what Elihu says when he wrote that God is over the righteous and his ears are open to their prayers. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12 makes that very clear. Aren't you glad that God watches over the righteous? And this morning, if you know Jesus Christ as your Savior, you're a child of God. You've come to the point where you've acknowledged your sin before Him, and you didn't run to your own righteousness to try to cover that sin, but you ran to Jesus to cover that sin. God watches over you in a special way. You are His child. He sees the struggles that you're going through. He knows that the things that are against you. He knows the emotions that you feel. He is in your corner. We've seen that already in the book of Job. God watches over the righteous. We love that truth. But as we move on, these remaining truths don't make us feel as good about ourselves. Now, God does right to the righteous. But just like a parent doing right to his kid is not always comfortable for the kid, right? Even so, God's dealings with us don't always make us feel good. And so we're going to look at 3 actions God takes as he does right to the righteous that the righteous, frankly, don't like at the outset. And Job doesn't like. But this is Elihu trying to elaborate. This is probably what God is doing here. Notice, beginning in verse 8, not only does God do right by watching over the righteous, but God does right by showing his own their sin. God does right by showing his people their sin. Look at what it says in verse 8. And if they be bound in fetters. Okay, now in our King James, they is in italics, means it's not in the original Hebrew, it's implied. But still, they is referring to who based on what we looked at in verse 7? Talk to me for a moment. Is it referring to the wicked or the righteous? Talk to me. The righteous. It's not talking about the wicked. Okay, so the righteous, if it says if they be bound in fetters, in other words, it feels like they're imprisoned. They got shackles on them. They can't go anywhere. They're restrained. And it goes on, describes in verse 8, and beholden in cords of affliction. So God is tying them with ropes, and it feels like they're being scourged. They're being whipped. Notice what it says in verse 9. Then he showeth them their work and their transgressions that they have exceeded. Now we can identify with verse 8. If you've lived any length of time, we can understand, oh yeah, you live life. Life is tough. There's fetters that come your way. There's bonds. There's whipping, it feels like sometimes. But why would God do that? Well, according to verse 9, he showeth them their work. Not like, hey, you've done a great job here. No, it's more like, I'm showing you your works. How your life doesn't really match up to where it ought to be. Even though you're righteous in people's eyes, it doesn't fully match up to where I want you to be. And then notice the latter part of verse 9, and their transgressions that they have exceeded. That phrase, they have exceeded, implies arrogance, pride. So he's basically saying, hey, I realize I deal with the righteous sometimes by afflicting them. It's not comfortable. But in doing that, I'm showing something to them. I'm showing them their sin and their pride that maybe no one else can see. Now, I'm going to illustrate this in just a moment. And I want to dispel maybe a false image we have of God's discipline. We view God's discipline as you really mess up, God spanks you. Isn't that how we view discipline? That's how we view discipline with our kids. You talk back to your mom, go to your room, you lose your privileges. Okay, you got into the cupboard, you ate this snack when you shouldn't have, okay, you miss out on dessert this next meal. I mean, that's kind of when we think of discipline, okay, you really messed up here, therefore these are the consequences. But when you look at this passage, as well as Hebrews chapter 12, there's no implication that the righteous are outwardly straying, that they're falling into sin, that they're backsliding, that they've just really let go of spiritual habits, but yet God is going to discipline them. And let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. First of all, Shiloh, can you come on up here just for a moment? So Shiloh, I'm going to have him just represent the typical discipline that we view as people. And so he has an anger problem. He has God's target all over him. Like, look at this huge sin. Everybody can see that Shiloh has an anger problem right now. Now, in real life, I've never seen Shiloh lose it, okay? Just for the record. But for the sake of the example, Shiloh has a big anger problem here. Can you see it? I mean, you spend any time with Shiloh, he's going to lose it. He's going to blow He's going to blow his stack. He's going to vent. He's going to cuss. I mean, watch out for Shiloh because he has this huge sin in his life. And I know how God's going to deal with him. God's going to spank him in his time. The law of sowing and reaping. God comes back and he's going to discipline his own. Because if Shiloh is really a child of God, God's going to spank him. That's how we view God's discipline, isn't it? That's how I view God's discipline. Let me ask you a question. Does God do that? Yeah, of course he does. If somebody has a major anger issue or lust or they're playing it loose with their spouse, God has his ways of spanking that. And we would call that maybe the bigger sins. Like that's a no-brainer. Everybody can see what's going on. So that's how we often view discipline. And there is a time and a place for that. But the majority of the time, God doesn't discipline us this way. Because we are too cultured and civilized to be holding on to this sin for the world to see. Because we're concerned about what other people think of us. And so really what we do is we don't necessarily go around like Shiloh saying, I got an anger problem here. Hey, look, I really lose it all the time. No, it's more of what I'm going to show with Nathaniel. So thank you so much, Shiloh, for coming up. Now, look at Nathaniel here on the other hand. I mean, does it get any more spiritual than this on a Sunday morning? I'm in a coat and a tie. And I mean, here he is. He was up helping with the music. And I believe Nathaniel has a good testimony and so forth. But for sake of this example, I think Nathaniel here actually represents where we are in the discipline God deals with us many times. Because when you look at Nathaniel, I mean, you can size him up. Do you see any sin in his life? There's no anger problem. He's not losing his temper. He doesn't have a major lust issue. He's not a big idol worshiper where he's all these things in his life crowding out God and crowding out the Bible and crowding out church. He's not just sliding towards the gutter, so to speak, in society. He's not hanging out with the wrong friends. He doesn't have a major vice or addiction that's going to take him out into left field. He's a good guy. Wouldn't you agree with me this morning? Nathaniel's a great guy. But God takes Nathaniel through some affliction. And what happens is, working through this affliction, he sheds his coat. He sheds his coat. And through feedback from others, can you turn around? Can you turn around? He has all these hidden sins that no one else can see and that he's not even aware of. But God wants to expose those little tiny sins that no one else can see and that he can't even see. And so let me look at a few of these sins, okay, that you weren't aware of. He wasn't even aware of because they're on his back. You see it? Pride. Pride. See, pride? I'm not arrogant. Have you been in any kind of conflict recently? Only by pride cometh contention. It takes two to fight. Two proud people to fight. And if you've been in strife and contention directly involved in that, that shows some level of ego and pride. That's an acceptable sin. But pride, I'm telling you, that's subtle. We're not even aware of it sometimes. But God uses affliction to reveal it. Sometimes drama to reveal it. Well, let me look at another one here. The fear of man. Really concerned about what other people think of us. Like we're doing this to make so-and-so happy. Or I don't want to do this because that's going to make them mad. The fear of man is subtle and it slips in. And the most spiritual of us on the outside can be struggling and being torn apart on the inside by the fear of man. Discontentment. I just don't like what God has given to me right now. I'm so restless. Paul dealt with that. I have learned in the whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. The psalmist said, be still and know that I am God. Discontentment. Well, I'm telling you, that can slip in there. That's an acceptable sin. And God uses trials in our life, affliction, to realize, hey, you're really discontent. You're not resting in me like you should be. That's only 3. Thanks for being a good sport here, Nathaniel. Got a couple more here. Envy. You're just upset at somebody else's success and you didn't get it. Why did they get to buy their first house and I didn't get to buy a new house? Why did they get the promotion and I didn't get the promotion? Why are they blessed with such a nice family and I don't have a nice family? Envy can creep in there in our own minds and our hearts. Here's another one. Oh. This one's really stuck. I can't even rip this one off. He's going to really have to repent from that one. Okay, here we go. I ripped it off. Idolatry. You see idolatry? Subtle idolatry. Putting our satisfaction and our happiness in something else higher than God. That's idolatry. And that can slip in, even with good things that our society offers. Another one is, I'm just going to start rapid fire here, apathy. Hey, I'm slacking in my spiritual routine. I'm not doing what I ought to do, but not even being aware of it. Hey, at least I'm doing better than those other people out there. But you're definitely apathetic compared to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so God reveals that. And a couple more here. We have one called lust. We have ingratitude, complaining, like I'm just discontent. I want more, I want more, I want more. Hey, constantly complaining like I'm ungrateful, not saying thank you, an absence of saying thank you and filling our lives with, God is so good, I'm so unworthy of this. And yet we're complaining and griping about what we don't have. You see, thank you so much. As Nathaniel turns around, God has worked in him, and through this trial that he's gone through has revealed all these subtle sins that he was not even aware of. Now we look at him. He's a good guy. He's serving God. I mean, most of us say, I want a kid that turns out like Nathaniel. But nonetheless, all of us have sin that we're not even aware of until we go through the trial. Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for coming up here just for a moment. That is God's primary focus in disciplining us. It's not because we're outwardly straying. It's because there's these sins that we're not even aware of. Now, if you know what your sin is and you're hanging on to it, it's coming. God will spank you. He has ways of doing that. But I think the vast majority of us are at best not aware of our sin, or at worst, in denial of our sin. And therefore, God brings affliction our way, such as strife in our life, some drama. He brings conflict. He brings a loss of friendship. He brings health issues. He can bring, a relocation. He just brings a difficult time into our life to reveal to us, these are your issues, and I'm disciplining you. And what he does is he brings the double mirror on us so we can see our back and all those sins that we saw in Nathaniel's back, where you can't see your back by looking in the mirror, can you? You got to have two mirrors, okay? I'm going to have the mirror back here. I'm going to hold a mirror right here, and then I can really see my back and those blind spots. And God has his ways of doing that through the tribulation that we go through. Now, are we all together on this idea that we all fall short of God? For all of sin comes short of the glory of God. Do you still fall short of the glory of God today? Have you done things today that still fall short of the glory of God? It's getting a little bit more personal, isn't it? Have you done some things that fall short of the glory of God that you're not even aware of? That's what trial reveals. And he brings us through the fire to reveal some of those sins. You say, man, this is painful. Why would he do that? Doesn't he love us? Doesn't he want us to feel good? Well, he's not done explaining. Look at verse 10. He openeth also their ear to discipline, and commanded that they return from iniquity. So the first thing he does is he watches over the righteous. We love that one. The second thing he does, he shows us our sin, even those respectable sins. The third way he does us right is he trains us or disciplines us. Now, the word for discipline in the Hebrew literally means rebuke. He opens up our ears. You see, when we're on the mountaintop with the wind blowing and the scenery is gorgeous, we don't hear anything else. It's amazing. But when we're down in the valley and it's dark and we're just straining to hear the next noise, we can hear God's voice a lot more clearly, can't we? So maybe another way of viewing this training, this discipline, we're not talking about a divine paddle up on our hind end. We're more talking boot camp that shows us how weak we are and how much we can't do and how much we're falling short of what the DI, the drill instructor, expects of us. And he's working in us to bring us up to that level spiritually. But he has to expose our inadequacy before we can get there. That's part of the training, the conditioning that goes into it. And so what happens is he trains us by showing us our weakness so we would rely upon his strength. He really shouts our failure so that we will trust his sovereign plan, not our own. He shows us how waffling we are on our own little roller coaster ride with our mood so that we get fixed on his unchanging purpose. And he deals with us by training and conditioning us to rely more upon him than ourselves. So he watches over us, he shows our sin, he disciplines or trains us, but then notice the choice given to us. So it's almost like it's all passive up to this point. These three are going to happen in our lives. We have God watching over us, we have God showing us our sin, we have, of course, the training that goes on, but the question is, how will we respond to it? And there's a fork in the road that emerges in Elihu's speech. And he explains one route of responding and another route of responding. And notice what he says in verse 11. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasures. Now, from a human standpoint, Elihu, in his limited perspective, 4,000 years ago, he's basically saying, hey, that if you respond, Job, the right way, if you confess your sin that God is revealing, I'm not calling you a major hypocrite like your friends are, okay? I'm not doing that. I'm just saying even righteous people, God works in to show them how they still fall short, how they still have these deficiencies, these iniquities. If you respond in a way where you acknowledge those, and notice the words, you obey and serve him. That word obey is actually the Hebrew word shema, which means to listen, to heed, to have your ears wide open. I'm going to heed this and then obey. I'm going to respond. So it has the idea of I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to act upon it. What's going to result? They shall spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasures. Now, when you look at physical blessing in the Old Testament, often that translates into spiritual blessing in the New Testament. I'm not going to digress and explain all that right now, but you see kind of a parallel there. So we're not going to preach this morning that because you respond the right way to God's discipline, God is going to bless you financially and numerically, and you're going to get an upgraded home, and you're going to have a lot nicer possessions. Your car is going to get a lot nicer, and you're going to be wealthy because you obey God. That's not what we see in the Scriptures. What was physical blessing in the Old Testament translates into spiritual blessing in the New Testament. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things, God's care, God's provision, a content life, making sure that you're cared for, just what you need, all these things shall be added unto you. God in the New Testament is more concerned about us just living simple, content lives, but then thriving spiritually. And so I'm going to apply it that way when Elihu says this. We're not going to apply this to the Old Testament Jews, which is physical prosperity, but rather for New Testament believers that God gives us a fork in the road when we respond the right way by saying, God, I'm listening, I'm going to obey. He allows us to just take off spiritually, to grow, to experience exponential advance in ways that we had not seen possible in maybe years gone by. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, for example, when we respond to something like the fear of man that I gave the example with Nathaniel, God can deepen in us the truth from Proverbs chapter 29, verse 25. The fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be saved. He can catapult your trust in God in ways he never was able to do that before if you heed his conviction to the fear of man. When it comes to discontentment and complaining, and God exposes, you are complaining, you are an ingrate as far as the way you're acting right now. And we confess that to God and say, God, I'm so sorry. I'm ungrateful for the way I've been navigating life. And we purpose to put 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18 in our heart. Hey, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. And we just make it a way of living that at the dinner table, we're going to share blessings of what God has done every single evening. Before I go to bed at night, I'm going to bullet point the blessings of God in my life. When I get up in the morning, before I ask for anything, I'm going to thank God for His goodness. As I hang out with other brothers and sisters, I want to make sure I'm talking about what God has done and how He's good in my life, not complaining about what I miss in my life. You see, God deepens our gratitude by pointing out our ingratitude. You see how this works? But it's a matter of responding the right way. But that's not the only option. The other option is given in verse 12. And if they obey not, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge. Anybody want to go that way? Saying, if you go that way, there's a law of sowing and reaping. You can continue on that route of ingratitude, and you're going to be miserable. Nobody's going to want to hang around you because you constantly complain. If you continue to go that path, lust, you can go that way of lust if you want to. You'll probably lose your marriage. You'll probably lose some other relationships. You're going to break trust. You can go that way if you want to. You can live in denial about that. When it comes to idolatry, you can go that way. You can find your fulfillment and satisfaction in things outside of God. You can do that, but you're going to miss out on ultimate joy and fulfillment. You probably have a lot less happiness going that route, a lot more misery than if you'd responded and said yes. You would have listened to the Shema, the warning. You would have heeded it like you should have. My point is this, that God brings us to the point of response so that we can choose one path or the other path. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about. When you light a candle, a cold candle, that wax underneath that candle just turns soft and melts into a liquid, doesn't it? And you can pour that wax out. You can do whatever you want with that wax. I don't necessarily recommend that, but you can do whatever you want with that wax. It's in a liquid state. It's moldable. On the other hand, I grew up in Oklahoma, and we have something called clay in Oklahoma. Like, it's all over the place in Oklahoma. And in the wintertime, I remember making just a few walks into my backyard on a beaten path where the grass had worn off, and you're down to that clay in the wintertime when it's been raining and it's all soppy. Man, you'll slip and slide. You come in, you have half the backyard on your shoes when you come in. I mean, it just sticks to your shoes. It's yuck. I mean, it's like worse than J.B. Weld on your shoes when you come inside, and it dries and hardens. But the summertime, that heat comes out, it turns into 100 degrees, grass hasn't grown, and that clay becomes like concrete. If my dad ever asked me to build a fence and put a fence post right there, that's a punishment. That's not a delight. Because trying to dig through that clay is horrendous. So our response, one way, shows that we're wax and moldable. Responding the other way makes us hardened clay. It's all in how we respond to the heat of the Son of God. As He draws close to us and works in our life, it's a matter of, am I going to become wax or I'm going to become hardened clay in response to the heat? Now, there's so many different ways we can work this out. When it comes to the gospel, the good news is that we fall short of God. We're sinners. Do you agree with me about that this morning? We are broken individuals. And when God convicts you of your sin, we can say, no, I'm going to turn away from that. I'm going to trust myself. I'm going to be good enough to get there. I think I can work hard to gain standing before God. You're going to become hard like clay. You're not going to be open to that good news and God working into your life because that's self-trust. On the other hand, if you open yourself up to the Son of God, realizing that Jesus died on the cross for me, He rose again the third day, I'm going to rely upon Him and Him alone to save me and change me, that makes us moldable. And God comes in and makes us new men, new women for His glory. It's all a matter of response, even when God convicts us. And if you're here this morning and you've been wanting to learn more about this Christianity thing, about God and about Jesus, you don't need to know the whole Bible to come to the point where you realize, I simply need Jesus, and I must turn to Him. And if that's where you are this morning, take the wax route, not the clay route of becoming harder. Now here are the hurdles in working through something like that. Sometimes we think we're listening, we're acting, but we're not. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Yeah? Yeah? Huh? Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, honey. Yeah? Yeah? I know what you're talking about. Yeah? Oh, what? You don't think I'm listening to you? Am I listening? We're faking our listening. I'm not tuned in on my wife. As I'm scrolling ESPN or Fox News or, surfing YouTube on my phone or going through my social media posts. And we could be doing the same thing with God. We're going through the motions. We're going, We're sitting in church. We're saying amen. We're singing along. But man, our mind is like a space cadet. We're in a different planet. We're really not listening to what's going on, what God might be saying to us. Hey, don't lie to yourself. If that's our condition, let's confess it for what it is and not call it listening. Let's call it faking it and say, God, help me to really listen and throw away the distractions so I can really lock in on you. Another hurdle is not just fake listening, but blaming others. Oh, I'm listening to God, but I hope they're really listening to God because they need this. No, you're not listening. If you're thinking about how somebody else needs it more than you do, you're not listening. You're not paying attention. As that classic song goes, it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's not somebody else's fault. I need God's grace. I need God's help. I need to let go of my ego so that God can work in my life. And so we got to make sure that we are not blaming others to crowd out our listening. Another one is, but I'm listening because I feel so good when I come to church. It just helps my week go better because I come to church and I'm around all these positive people. And I just feel good. I feel good about doing that. It was good to hear, the pastor preach. It's good to sing those songs. And I just feel good. Listening is not a feeling. You could be letting that good feeling crowd out the listening of what God has for you. Now, but believe me, when we have a good feeling, we might be a little bit more open to listening than when we got a bad feeling. I get that. But don't mistake a good feeling with listening. Sometimes good feelings can make us have potatoes in our ears, and we miss out on what God is actually saying. Now, I realize what some of you are thinking, but speaking of feeling, when somebody shows me my sin, I don't feel good. When I'm in the middle of tribulation, I'm not having positive emotions. When I'm going through a difficult time where God is maybe working in me or it's just this low valley, it seems like, there's no positive in my heart and in my soul. How in the world can I detect God's truth versus my negative emotions? How do I discern that? Because, I realize that God's truth is over here. This is what He's trying to say to me, but I have these negative emotions over here. How do I separate the two and navigate so I can get the truth of God's Word rather than being blinded by my feeling? Have you ever wrestled with that like I have? Here's just a quick bit of advice. If that's the case, get some outside counsel from a trusted, godly friend who is not just there to stoke your ego. Somebody who is removed from the emotions, somebody who is removed from that situation a little bit. That's why it says in the multitude of counselors there is safety. And let them breathe into your life. Get feedback from them. Continue to look at the Word. Continue to seek God. Let time pass a little bit because emotions go up and down, don't they? And so if I'm feeling this way today, I'm not going to probably be feeling this way next week. Maybe it'll subside. Maybe I can see the truth. So those two things, the counsel of others and letting some time pass as we continue to seek the Lord, can balance out those crazy emotions sometimes so we can hear the voice of God a little bit more clearly and see the truth that he has for us, that he's trying to teach us. So what's the takeaway from this? So going back to the heat and the wax, it's really simple. Based on what we see in Elihu's wisdom and the heat of the Son of God, choose the path of wax, not of clay. Did you get that? When faced with the heat of the Son of God, God's dealing in your life, choose the path of wax, not of clay. And let me assure you, it's the path least taken by others. The majority is following the path of clay. I won't digress into that right now to prove that point. I think you can see that looking around our world. The vast number of people respond the wrong way to affliction in their life, which takes me to the classic poem written by Robert Frost in 1915, The Road Not Taken. I'm not going to read the whole poem, just the last stanza. Listen to Frost's words. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Hey, here's the challenge for all of us this morning. Let's take the path laid out by Elihu, less traveled, so that we can experience all the difference. Let's go and stand with heads bowed and eyes closed.